I am so happy to see you here to learn about some concerning issues to me, and a lot of my constituents have brought up concerns about wireless technology and the new 5G that will be implemented in a lot of our cities, and it's rolling out into the other spaces. So I have invited some guests, and we are hosting them to give us the information that we need on this wireless technology and how it affects our bodies, how it affects our minds, how it affects our children. And from what I've been learning, it is not good. So, and it has everlasting effects, and we need to raise awareness on this subject. It's like carbon monoxide poisoning. It's something you don't see, and it will kill you. And this, again, people don't see it, so they do not think there's a threat. But there is a big threat, because this is moving in faster than we know, and we need to be aware and protect ourselves. So hopefully we can take something away from this and maybe form some legislation in advance of what's coming, and to protect ourselves and to be aware of the situation of what we're dealing with. So I am going to introduce right now Cece Duchette. She is a communications director, and she also, she'll explain what she does. So Cece, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Senator Morgan. It is such an honor and a privilege to be here with you today to talk about the health effects of wireless technology. And I will come back to the microphone after we hear from Dr. Annie Sasco. Dr. Annie Sasco is a world-leading scientist. She's also a medical doctor. She holds 3 degrees from Harvard, and she will tell you a little bit more about her credentials. But I think what is most important for us today is to understand that she was a leader with the World Health Organization. So she thoroughly understands the risks of wireless technology, not just 5G, but also the 2G, 3G, 4G, that we are living with today, and that just means the different generations of technology. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Sasco from France, and she will tell us the science. Thank you.
So first of all, I would like to thank Senator to invite me here. It's a great honor to be here today. I want to thank, of course, Cece, who got me into this. Who am I? I'm an MD, and therefore my goal in life was to cure people. But even more than that, maybe to prevent disease. Because I go back to the Hippocratic principle, primum non nocere, first do no harm. Of course, once the disease is here, we have to treat it. But if we can prevent it, it will make much more sense for the well-being of the people, and also, in fact, also for the economics of country, because treated people cost a lot. So why did I get into this field? Well, as I said, I'm an MD in France. I did occupational medicine, public health, but I was not satisfied that I was going deep enough in the topic. So that's when I decided to come to Harvard to get first an MPH, then a Master of Science in Biostat and Epi, and then a doctoral degree in epidemiology, biostatistics, and evaluation. And I think all my life long, my goal has really been more and more towards prevention, although I love the contact with the patients. And which kind of things, given I was working with cancer, was I dealing with? Of course, at the beginning I worked on tobacco and alcohol, diet, the usual lifestyle, physical exercise, exposure to the sun. But over the years of my career, I spent 22 years at the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is the specialized cancer agency of the World Health Organization. And I saw cancer incidence rates which kept on going up and up and up all over the world. And in fact, the number of cancer cases more than doubled from the time I started to nowadays. So of course we know that the population increases in the world, and that we take into account. We know that the population is aging, and that also we take into account. But that doesn't explain it all. Neither does the fact of doing better diagnosis, more screening, and the like. And nowadays, I'm really focusing my interest, and I think that's where we will need really more studies to be done and more action to be done, is on children. Because if you say cancer is increasing, immediately people tell you, it's just because people live longer. But the kids, they always have the same age, so they are not older than they were before. And we know that if it were a genetic cause, it doesn't change in 25 years. Genetics, it takes hundreds of years, millennium maybe, to change. Behavioral, yes, of course, the kids do not behave exactly nowadays as they did in the past. But nevertheless, the change has not been drastic. So what remains? And it remains the environment. The fact that in the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, the soil we put our feet on, and all the objects almost of daily living, we find now plenty of carcinogens, hundreds of carcinogens. Chemical, we all know about pesticides, about growth promoters, about whatever, conservatives, flame retardants, all these things. That's for the chemical field. And for the physical agents, we are talking about radiations. Be they ionizing radiation, which is what you get when you get an X-ray, or if you live close to a nuclear plant, or when there is a nuclear accident, that's ionizing radiation. And of course, this is a carcinogen. And we can, the good thing, I would not use such a term, but the thing about ionizing radiation is that at least it leaves, in a way, a signature. So there is very clear genotoxicity. So if you look at the cell, at the DNA, it's modified. And then we get into the field of non-ionizing radiation. So they are still radiation, defined in terms of frequency and wavelength. So physicists have these beautiful charts, and I'm sure in some of these there is, and I have some drawings of that. It goes from the normal electromagnetic field of the Earth to higher and higher frequencies. So then you have all the wavelengths which are being used for cell phones, for microwaves oven, for radars, and then also the ionizing radiation, and then just the light of the sun is also radiation. So the matter becomes quite difficult to assess because the effect will, of course, in part depend on exactly which frequency, which wavelengths are we dealing with. And the difficulty nowadays when discussing the 5G rollout is that in fact it's so new that all these values have not even been defined. So that's the reason why all over the world, or at least in several parts of the world, they are picking up test cities where they are going to see, exactly which kind of frequency they will use. But the problem is, as far as I am concerned, that this is going to be done without any prior experiment, for example, on experimental animals, on rats and mice, to see how they would react. And of course, as humans, we love to think that we are very different from rats and mice, or other animals, and we are, of course, you can see it, but on the other hand, a large part of our genome is the same. So what is not good for a rat is, most of it is all the time, not good for humans. So in fact, in the past 50 years, the studies which have been done to look at the carcinogenicity of new substances or newly introduced physical agents, when they turned out to be carcinogenic for rats and mice, then years later, because of course we live longer than a rat, they turn out to be carcinogenic also for humans. Maybe not exactly at the same site in the body, but nevertheless. And I think it would be safe, to say the least, that at least before trying on new frequencies, there could have been a nice study done in experimental animals. And this has not been done, is not even going to be done, from what I know. So what am I saying today if we don't know anything? Well, we know quite a lot on the preceding generations of radio frequencies, so the 2G and 3Gs, which were used for cell phone since the late 1980s, 1990s. So on this one, we have sufficient delay to be able to see what the effects are. My field is cancer, so I'm mostly going to talk about what I know, because I think when you're a real expert, you should not talk about everything. You are an expert in one given field. So I will center on cancer, and of course I will say a few words about other diseases, because they are also important. But in fact, cancer has been the best studied so far effect of 2G, 3G cell phone use. So we have studies which have been done on people, in particular with brain tumors. That's the main outcome, because when you're holding a cell phone, of course, you're holding it close to your head. Whereas if you cook food in a microwave, it's further away. And I always told my young kids when they were young, now they're old, I said, you don't need to watch the food cooking. Because even if the microwave is supposed not to give out any radiation, as soon as it's a little hole and the door is a little loose, then nevertheless there is microwaves also coming out from there. But usually you don't put your head in a microwave. Whereas you really, with a phone, you are very close from the source. So back in the 1990s, studies started being done on brain tumors in adults. In the Nordic countries, in Sweden, Norway, Finland, by a group led by Ardell. He was among the first to do this kind of studies. And asking people with brain tumors and also people who didn't have brain tumors, which we called reference, about their story of phone use and how they were using it, on which side of the head were they holding their phone, if they were using it for how many minutes a day. And at that time, a regular user was defined as someone giving at least one phone call per week for 6 months. So of course, we are not really in the same ballgame nowadays. But even that, at that time, what we could see was that the people who had been using their cell phone most, or who were using, because radiations are more or less the same, cordless phones, had an increased risk of brain tumor. And what was very interesting in that Nordic study was that he asked people at what age did they start using a cell phone. And it defined as young age, less than 20 years of age. And there, the people who had started using a cell phone before the age of 20 had about a twofold increased risk of brain tumors. So they would get brain tumors at twice the rate of a non-exposed general population. And at the same time, another very large study was being done by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, the IRC, which was called the Interphone study, which was conducted in 13 countries, not the USA. They didn't choose to participate, but Canada was in there, Australia, etc., and a number of countries in Europe, Israel. They did the same kind of study, comparing the people who got brain tumors with the ones who didn't get it. And some national results, even it was in different countries, started coming out. If you look at, have you ever used a cell phone versus no, then of course you don't find any difference. But in each study, when we were looking at the ones who had been using a cell phone for more than 10 years, or a greater amount of time per day, or at an earlier age, then they were the ones who had an increased risk. And we had this result for 9 countries. But we had to wait 5 years before getting the final result out on all 13 countries, so on 6,600 cases of brain tumors. So very large numbers. And in the overall analysis, we had the same thing. It was only the most heavily exposed who had an increased risk at 1.3 to 2, depending if it was the tumor was on the same side of the head where they were usually holding their phones, and depending on the location within the brain of the tumor. The most affected parts being, of course, the temporal lobe and also the frontal lobe, so where the phone was closest. Why did we have to wait such a long time before getting the result printed? I think the collaborators from these 13 countries could not agree on the words to put around the figures. The figures were in the tables. We could see there was a risk in one group that most heavily exposed by yesterday's standards, because by nowadays standards, they are very little users, had an increased risk. And the way it was written up in the end was an exceedingly cautious, but not in going in the right direction way, saying, yes, we find an increased risk for these heavy users, but they were some incredibly high value of use, people who had been using a phone for more than 1 hour a day. Nowadays would not be incredible at all. And therefore, we don't know if it's just by chance. Okay, whereas my own analysis was, you see the risk where you expect to see it in the ones who have been using cell phone in the heaviest way, however you would define it. It was at that time, when that study came out, that the IRC decided to convene a group of experts, who are people from all over the world, from different countries, who come to spend 10 days at IRC in Lyon and spend their time analyzing anything which has been published on the topic in a peer-reviewed journals. So they don't look, for example, at studies done by the industry, but which were never published. So the process had to be through a peer-reviewed journal to make sure that a sufficient quality was there in the study to get to some conclusion. And at that time, in 2011, they came up with a conclusion of limited evidence of carcinogenicity in humans, and they also looked at the animal study, and at that time also they came to limited evidence in animals, and therefore the EMF radiations made it to a group 2B category, which means a possible carcinogen. You have to know, in the IRC scale of carcinogenicity, at the top you have a group 1, where you have no doubt whatsoever that the substance is carcinogenic. There's no question. Group 2A, it's a probable carcinogen. So you have some evidence, but you still have some questions in your mind. 2B, possible. Again, there you have some evidence, but really not that much. Then you have a group 3, which is very often presented by people saying it's not a carcinogen, whereas it's not what it means. Group 3 means, for the time being, we don't have enough evidence to be able to classify this compound as to the carcinogenicity to humans. So it means we do not know, which is very different from saying we know it's not dangerous. And then there's a group 4 for non-carcinogenic, but where you hardly have anything. There's one compound, caprolactam, because you don't go through that very extensive evaluation process for something you don't even suspect of being a carcinogen. So that was the situation in 2011, and what was classified as a 2B was electromagnetic field radiations. So it did not specify that it was only for cell phones, and in fact it applied to any device which can emit EMF. So it's cell phone, it's Wi-Fi, it's of course the antenna, it's all connected objects, but it's yet limited evidence. What has been happening since then? There have been one more study done in France, in fact Serenat, who looked again at brain cancer in adults and again found that the heavy users, defined in that study as people using their cell phone more than 30 minutes a day, have a risk of about 2.5 to develop a brain tumor. What was not evaluated at the time of a monograph, and I am very angry about that, was a study done on brain cancer in children and adolescents, which was carried out in Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Switzerland, so in 4 countries. Of course, on a somewhat limited number of brain cancer cases, because these are not very big countries, so there were about 352 something, if I'm not mistaken, cases of brain tumors, and again, reference. This study is presented as a negative study with very strong affirmations in the conclusion, saying this study argues against the causal association between cell phone and brain tumor, and there is really nothing in favor of the carcinogenicity of cell phones. That's not at all the way I'm looking at it, because in that study, which was too small, in fact, to reach the level of statistical significance. What is statistical significance? It's a measure which will tell you, in a way, from a statistical point of view, no biology, no whatever, whether it's likely that the result you are getting is due to chance or is the real thing. So there are 2 elements which have to be considered when you look at the result. That level of statistical significance, because it gives you more confidence if a study has been done on a large population, but also the value of a measure of risk, which is called an odds ratio for statistical reasons. But in fact, it's an estimate of a relative risk. And it tells you by how much the risk is increased if you are exposed versus not exposed. So if we take the example of tobacco smoking and lung cancer, that relative risk is of the order of 20. So if you smoke compared to someone who doesn't smoke, then you have got 20 times the risk of getting a lung cancer. When we are looking at the EMF, we are not in that type of high numbers. Because it was the exposure from the old days, because it was just the starting point of being exposed to these microwaves, so the results are around 1.3 to at most 3 in some categories. So they are smaller. I mean, it's just not like the epidemic of lung cancer for the time being. But nevertheless, there is a risk. And believe me, as an MD, getting glioblastoma is no fun. It's the most aggressive type of brain tumor, and a lot of people are going, all of them, in fact, are going to die from it after a longer or shorter time. So that cephalo study had these values which were going from 1.04, okay, that's close to 1, let's forget about it, up to 6.15 for some categories. And out of the 116, I recomputed them recently because I felt, it's just unbelievable. In 5 tables, or 6 tables, but 5 given odds ratio. In those 5 tables, there were 116 odds ratio presented. 97 of these were greater than 1, so were indicative of a risk. Of course, given the numbers were small, only one reached statistical significance, and it was interesting to note that was for the kids who had subscription in their own name. So most probably were adolescents, later adolescents, were the heaviest users. So that's very worrisome. And the few odds ratio 19, which were lower than 1 or at 1, makes sense because they were for location of the brain in the central part of the brain, so least exposed and the temporal lobes. And so I felt this is a very positive study. What bothers me most about this study is that it was, according to the dates, accepted for publication on the 7th of June 2011. And that was only 2 weeks after the monograph meeting. And during the monograph meeting, there were among the participants people who were authors on that paper. So they knew that study existed. And usually when at IRC we do an evaluation for substance, and we know that there are some papers in the pipeline, we usually ask the journals if a paper is accepted to have, a pre-press, a preprint, and have already this data to examine. And I recently, in fact, at the time I didn't even think about it, but now I'm really exceedingly unhappy with the fact that this study was not discussed. Because had it been discussed, I know some would have argued nothing is statistically significant, but forget about it. But I think some members of the working groups would have said that seeing all this increased odds ratio was really not reassuring. And if it were to be reevaluated nowadays, I think it will get it. Since then, another study got done, which is the MobiKid study, which was done on kids or young people between the ages of 10 to 24. So older children, adolescents, young adults. That study has been conducted in 14 countries. Again, the USA is not in there. Nowhere any of the 4 countries of the first study, which I think is interesting. Now we will have almost 900 cases of brain tumors. So now, if the results in that study are similar to what they had in cephalo, everything will be statistically significant, and then it will be really a group 1 carcinogen. My problem with that study is they ended close to databases December 2015. 13th of January 2017, they had to send a final report to the European Commission, given it was funded by the European Commission. And you can find that final report online. They describe what was the study like, what they did, the validation study, all of that, which is perfect, but there is not one single line on the result, except that they are saying, and I will read it to you, analysis of the association between mobile phone use and brain tumor risk. as well as between estimated radio frequency and ELF. ELF, it's the extremely low frequency. So that's what you are getting from the power lines and very high power lines. Exposure at the location of a tumor and risk of brain tumors have been conducted, and a publication is in preparation. Results, however, cannot be made public until publication in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. Okay. And a few pages later, regarding the dissemination and exploitation of the results, since the final analyses are ongoing, the main results of the study are not published yet. Documents to inform the general public about the main result of the study will be prepared as soon as the final results are available. Due to the widespread usage of communication devices, such as mobile phone, the result of a study regarding potential detrimental health effects will most likely receive a considerable degree of public attention and can potentially have significant societal implications. So far, the extensive use of very different means of communication has contributed to increase the public understanding regarding electromagnetic fields and their potential impact on health. Now, remind me, which year are we in? 2019, more than 2 years later, not a single result has yet appeared. So I think now I'm going to various places, London, Denmark, here, to say we need to get these results out. Either they are negative, they didn't find anything, okay, people have to know, they will be reassured. Or they are similar to what we had before with cephalo, meaning there is an increased risk for kids, adolescents, and young adults to get brain cancer, which is really not a gift to get. And it has to be known. To have very strong legislation, to have public awareness, you cannot keep silent any longer. I don't want to put pressure on the individual investigators, because I know some of them, one of them at least, is on the verge of committing suicide. She can no longer take the pressure, which is just unbelievable, for keeping these things out of publication. I don't know how best to do it, because there are some ways, right, to know these kind of things in European to get access to scientific data which have been collected through public funding, and therefore belongs to all the European citizens. It works for clinical trials. It does not apply, God knows why, to epidemiology. So I really hope that we need to ask WHO, to ask IRC, the head of the institutions. They can take the pressure. Otherwise, they should not have been head of institution, to get these things out. Because if that kind of things come out, I mean, it's a bomb. It's really, there will be no discussion whatsoever about the carcinogenicity of this EMF. And to see, so that was referring, of course, to 2G, 3G phones as they were used in the past. Nowadays, already, I mean, kids, very young, start having a cell phone. And then if they sit in classrooms where you have Wi-Fi router, and they have a wireless computer, not one, 20 wireless computers in a classroom, the routers, all of it, the cell phones in their pockets. These kind of things, as all over environmental carcinogens, if we're discussing pesticides, I could say more or less the same thing. They are, cumulative. So the more things you're exposed to, even if we cannot be 100% sure that it's thing 1 or thing 2 which gives you cancer, what gives you cancer is the mixture of all these carcinogens we are living in. In addition, physical carcinogens like EMF interact with chemical carcinogens, interact with metals, interact with some biological substances. So it makes things even worse. And I think it's not responsible for people to decide to expose population to a huge amount of microwaves. They will tell me, yeah, but it's not going to be the same wavelength. Okay, fine. It's not going to same frequency. Yeah, but I know, because it will be much higher frequency. And as you know, our cells, the cells of humans, the cells of animals, but the cells also of plants, of trees, they can adapt to something continuous sometimes, but this on, off all the time, of course it has an impact on the way the cell is functioning, on the permeability of the membrane of a cell, of the permeability of blood vessels, which makes it easier for toxic, there is the hematoencephalic barrier we talk about, because in fact our brain is kind of protected from a number of toxins we have in our body and in our blood. But with this type of frequencies, then the vessels are going to become more porous and more stuff will go into our brain and other organs. And cancer is only one part of the picture. As I said, that's what I know best, so that's what I'm talking about, especially among kids, because I think it's exceedingly urgent to get this result out. I'll do anything I can, and based on this kind of thing, really have strict regulation.